The Nullarbor Plain, named after the Latin words for no tree, is a land seemingly untouched by time. Formerly the floor of the ocean, today it is an ocean of land, separating the east of Australia from the west. Although occupied by the Mirning Aboriginal nation for over 60,000 years, travel across the vast plain has always been difficult. Following British settlement, the colony of Western Australia was isolated from the rest of the continent by this vast expanse. The only viable transport going east was a slow sea voyage along the south coast of Australia. At Federation in 1901, forming the Commonwealth of Australia, an inducement to Western Australia to join the new nation was the construction of a railway. The enormity of the task was too great for the railway systems of Western Australia and South Australia to undertake. As a result, the new Commonwealth government formed the Commonwealth Railways. Starting at Port Augusta in South Australia, the proposed line would run across the Nullarbor Plain to Kalgoorlie in Western Australia, binding the nation together by rail. The new line would be built to standard gauge, meaning that a break of gauge would exist between the new transcontinental railway and the existing narrow gauge networks of South Australia and Western Australia. Nevertheless, a new transcontinental railway was to be built, dramatically cutting the time taken across the nation. Construction commenced in 1912 and took 5 years to complete, with difficulties owing to World War I delaying construction. For the entire 1,051 miles, or 1,691 kilometres of the new Trans-Australia Railway, no permanent sources of surface water were available. The only water available along the line would have to come from bores sunk into the ground, tapping water from the Great Artesian Basin. The first train would eventually depart Port Augusta on the 22nd of October 1917, bound for Kalgoorlie. A new era in Australian transport, with rail stretching right the way across the continent, had begun. The operating conditions and logistical difficulties faced by the Commonwealth Railways were nothing short of extreme. Despite the enormous effort and expense spent on sinking bores across the Nullarbor, the water supplied was mostly of poor quality. This would greatly increase locomotive repair costs, and in particular, boiler maintenance. Another issue for the new railway was the supply of coal. Neither South Australia or Western Australia had a supply of coal of suitable quality for locomotive use. As a result, coal would have to be shipped over from New South Wales to Port Augusta, before being sent by train to various coaling stages along the length of the new railway. Poor quality water, distant coal supplies and expensive maintenance demands meant that alternate forms of motive power were of keen interest to Henry Dean, the engineer-in-chief of the Commonwealth Railways. As early as 1912, investigations were taking place into suitable locomotives powered by internal combustion engines. In particular, a proposal for a 1,000 horsepower thermoelectric engine by British locomotive builder Hawthorne Leslie, based on the Paragon system, was investigated. The benefits of locomotives powered by internal combustion engines, when compared to steam operation, were simply too great to ignore. Unfortunately, the technology was in its infancy. While offering great promise, concerns around the reliability of the proposed locomotives in desert conditions, the doubling of cost of the Hawthorne Leslie design, and wartime delays meant that steam operation would reluctantly be adopted. From the start of construction in 1912 until dieselisation was completed, the fleet of steam locomotives used by the Commonwealth Railways comprised an eclectic collection of new and second-hand motive power. A total of 97 standard gauge steam locomotives, including 2 locomotive cranes, were ultimately employed in service on the Trans-Australia Railway. The backbone of the steam fleet comprised of the G and C classes in passenger service, while freight operations were handled by the K and KA classes. All four of these designs were essentially duplicates of locomotives used by the New South Wales Government Railways, but had to be modified to do battle with the harsh conditions of the Nullarbor Plain. The first large group of new locomotives acquired by the Commonwealth Railways were the G class. 26 of these 460 locomotives were built by Clyde Engineering in New South Wales, the Toowoomba Foundry in Queensland, and the Baldwin Locomotive Works in the United States. The G-class locomotives were based on the New South Wales C32 class, 191 of these highly successful locomotives being built between 1892 and 1911. Entering service between 1914 and 1917, the G-class were initially used on construction trains. Once the line was opened, they were placed on express passenger duties from Port Augusta to Kalgoorlie. It is worthy to note that when the inaugural passenger service ran in 1917, 11 G-class engines were ultimately needed to complete the journey, owing to mechanical failures partially caused by the desert conditions. Sand entering and damaging the locomotive and tender axle bearings was a continual problem. During the 1920s, it became regular practice for 4 G-class engines to run the length of the Trans-Australia Railway in relay form. After 1933, the locomotives were pushed even harder when only 2 engines would be used, with the changeover taking place in Cook. The 539-mile or 867-kilometre run an engine would make from Cook to Kalgoorlie was claimed to be the longest run by a coal-burning locomotive in the world at the time. Continual modifications were made to the G-class to help with the desert crossing. Louvers were installed to the cabs to provide the crews with a small amount of relief from the desert sun, while electric headlights and enlarged tenders with a greater coal and water capacity were fitted. Even with the tender modifications, it was still a common practice for additional water tanks, known as water gins, to be used on mainline services. The horrendous quality of the bore water used meant that boiler repairs were a constant problem. It is known that between 1919 and 1921, 4 G-class boilers had to be replaced after only 5 or 6 years of operation. The first member of the class to be withdrawn was G8 in 1925 after only 11 years of service. After the arrival of the C-class in 1938, the remaining G-class engines were used in freight service. Withdrawals continued as maintenance demands dictated, although most would survive until after World War II. All, however, were quickly withdrawn following the arrival of diesels between 1951 and 1952. While passenger services were handled by the G-class, the task of moving freight was the domain of the closely related K and KA classes. Based on the New South Wales D50 and D53 classes of 280 standard goods locomotives, 470 of these engines across both classes were built between 1896 and 1917. Keen to emulate the success of the New South Wales engines, the Commonwealth Railways ordered 8 of the D50 class to become known as the K class from the North British Locomotive Company, entering service in 1916. Not long after ordering the K class, it was felt that the projected freight demand would require an additional 12 locomotives. For reasons unknown, the D53 class design was selected, despite the multiple differences between the two types, including a different design of boiler. Ignoring the advice of the new Engineer-in-Chief Norris Bell, who had replaced Henry Dean in 1915, orders were placed for not 12, but 26 of the new design, to be known as the KA class. The construction of some of the G class by Baldwin had caused something of an uproar by Australian locomotive manufacturers, especially as a new major client was owned by the Commonwealth Government. To keep the peace, an order of 20 engines was placed with Walkers Limited in Queensland, with the remaining 6 being built by Perry Engineering in South Australia. With 34 of the K and KA class engines available, the Commonwealth Railways had more than enough freight locomotives during the steam era to meet their needs. In fact, some of the KA class engines were placed into storage upon delivery. Prior to World War II, some of the surplus engines were offered for sale, not only in Australia but also to China. With the boom in wartime traffic, some of the stored engines were put into service. Unfortunately, the Nullarbor climate and strains of wartime operation meant that mechanical reliability suffered. In fact, surplus engines from the United States and Canada had to be imported to help keep the traffic moving. By 1946, 17K and KA class engines had been withdrawn from service, although KA-38 had been withdrawn as early as 1925. The rest would go by 1952, following the arrival of diesels. Scrapping of these engines would be completed by 1961, with some reports stating that dynamite was used as part of the process. Probably the most remarkable steam locomotives used by the Commonwealth Railways were the C-Class. In 1937, the Trans-Australia Railway was extended 56 miles or 90 kilometres southwards from Port Augusta to Port Pirie. This would meet up with a new direct broad gauge connection from Adelaide, built by the neighbouring South Australian Railways. This connection would replace the very slow and indirect narrow gauge line running from Tarawi to Port Augusta via Quorn. With the new direct connection, a desire to speed up services and displace the hard-pressed G-Class from frontline traffic, a new express passenger engine was sought. Once again, the New South Wales Government Railways would provide the design inspiration. In 1925, the first of an eventual 75 C36 class 460 locomotives would enter service, entering traffic on top-link express services, displacing smaller engines. These locomotives were free steaming and fast running, and their qualities were exactly what the Commonwealth Railways were looking for. One major design change between the new C-Class and the original C36 class in engines in New South Wales was the fitting of new 12-wheel bogie tenders to the C-Class. These new tenders were requested by the Commonwealth Railways to assist with long-distance running across the Nullarbor, enabling a far greater water and coal capacity to be carried. Walkers Limited in Queensland would be awarded the contract to build the C-Class. Not only would these be the largest steam locomotives ever constructed by the company, but the enormous tenders would have to be assembled in the company's own shipyard. All of the C-Class would enter service in 1938 and immediately became the flagship engine of the Trans-Australia Railway. Despite the harsh conditions, these engines proved to be reliable workhorses. From 1943, these engines would operate the entire length of the Trans-Australia Railway solo, eliminating the previous practice of swapping engines in Cook. Covering the entire 1,051 miles, or 1,691 kilometres between Port Augusta and Kalgoorlie behind a single steam locomotive in regular service must surely be a record. However, increasing train tonnages and the effects of long-distance running meant that reliability was becoming a problem. Despite their remarkable feats achieved in service, the C-Class were quickly demoted from frontline passenger duties when diesels arrived. After being demoted to shunting and freight work, all of the C-Class were withdrawn from service between 1952 and 1956. One, however, was kept on standby near Kalgoorlie until 1960, in case of flooding affecting the diesel fleet. All were finally scrapped during the 1960s.